Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this second session of Conservation on Tap at the Okavango Craft Brewery. This event is supported by Kwando. So this session that we're doing is on carnivores. So essentially the purpose of these talks are to bring together experts in various topics. They don't have to be academics. They just have a lot of experience with this particular topic. So this evening, we've got three such lovely people. Starting to my left, we have Brad Bestelink from the Natural History Film Unit, who has spent a lot of time watching and filming carnivores. In the middle, we have Megan Claase, from Botswana Predator Conservation Trust, who spent a lot of time breaking vehicles, chasing wild dogs. And on the end, we've got Robynne Kotze from WildCRU, who has spent a lot of time looking for lions, which was her project before she joined WildCRU. No confirmation that she ever found them, but she looked a lot. Okay. Who am I handing over to? Robynne.
Thanks, Emily. Based on the fact that last time was rather informal, we've kind of thrown a few slides together, but what we really want to do is make this a discussion. So I've been nominated to start. So I'm just going to go a little bit into the work that we're currently doing in Botswana and put it in the context kind of the greater picture in terms of lions. My background has really been lion research. So I've been working in the Delta since about 2012. I started with an organization doing research in the Western Delta. And in 2017, I joined WildCRU and kind of expanded from the Okavango to other areas of northern Botswana. What people don't really realize about lions is that the numbers at the moment are actually quite low. We have an estimated 24,000 lions left, basically, in the whole of Africa. And in the last 30 years, we've had a 50% decline. And Botswana is really one of the key lion populations left in the world. So you can see on the right of the map there, that is basically what we would refer to as a connectivity map. And you can see those areas in red are areas of really high connectivity. And this is probably the largest, most connected lion population left in Africa. And projections going into the future indicate that in about 50 years' time, this might be the most important lion population. So our current research has revolved around looking into this connectivity, importantly estimating how many lions we have left in Botswana, because even though they're quite visible, they're actually really hard to count on a really big scale. So we've been using things like camera traps to look at densities. Megan has been using camera traps to look at behavior. And Brad has much more fancy cameras. So he'll have some good insights into behavior. And we've all worked in the Delta for a really long time. So hopefully we can give you some good insights into what's going on there. And just to show how this overlaps, I'm going to hand over to Megan and she'll show you some of the connectivity maps that they've been working on for the wild dogs.
Hello. So my name's Megan and I've been with BPC, Botswana Predator Conservation, since about 2015. You guys probably all know the organization's been around a long time, and we have historically been doing the long-term population monitoring in the Santawani and Maremi area on the Eastern Delta. And one of the things that was missing from our long-term data collection was dispersal, because it's actually very, very difficult for us to distinguish between dispersal and death in the wild dogs. So as collar technology has improved and we can have small satellite collars on dogs, we have been targeting dispersing individuals to see where they go, because that's something that's been relatively understudied. And this is where it all connects to the Khaza area and the connectivity maps, because it's important to see where they go and where they can't go in terms of population monitoring and demographic projections. And this map on the screen is one that my colleague generated, which is a connectivity map in the Khaza area. And it is pretty similar to the lion map. So it just, again, shows that this is a very, very important area for dogs and lions and large carnivores in general. Robyn touched on the fact that we use camera traps for some of our behavioural monitoring. Another thing that we are trying to do is improve our monitoring of the wild dogs using tourist pictures and camera traps from Robyn as well. And the way that we can do that is because the dogs you can individually identify them quite easily. So we have a cool collaboration with African Carnivore Workbook, which has machine learning where we can, basically you put your picture onto the website and some cool algorithms run and they match individuals, and it basically saves a lot of our time. And Robyn is also using this.
So one of the advances we've been looking into, especially with camera trap data, because we generate such massive amounts of data. I think for the Delta, we recorded over 800,000 pictures, and that's a lot of sorting and a lot of time. So we've been working with a company in South Africa called Innoventix that basically uses artificial intelligence to help sort pictures for us. And that's been really key in us getting results really quickly. Basically, our efforts over the last couple of years, and this has been done in partnership with a lot of the tourism organizations in the area. So I know a lot of you are present here tonight. So you'll finally get a little bit of insight into what the total Delta surveys have revealed. So these are the camera trap surveys we've done over the last couple of years. We started in 2017. And we finished in collaboration with BPC in 2020. And one of the main aims was to basically answer the question is how many of the different carnivores do we have in the Okavango? And so we put all of this together, and after lots of picture sorting, after lots of individual identification, and that is basically going through every lion picture, every leopard picture, assigning it an individual ID, and then using that to estimate a density. We've produced these density maps that indicate the distribution of lions across the Delta. And as you can see, Chiefs Island is very high. We have an estimated about 13.2 lions per 100 square kilometer, which is a very high number. And then lower densities on the periphery. All right, so I guess the next logical question is, right, so how many lions are there in the Delta? And this is a little bit of a technical question to ask, because one of the really tricky things has actually been modeling the densities around the flood. The lions are very much affected by the flood, and as the previous talk indicated that the Delta is always in flux, and this flux has an influence on lion populations. So generally, the research over the past decade has shown that when the flood levels are really high, that lion numbers tend to drop, and that when the flood is really low, and as Mike was explaining this, usually it's a multi-decadal cycle, so it might be 10 years where you have relatively high flood and another 10 years where you have relatively low flood. So as soon as that flood drops again, then the number of lions climbs once again. So this has been really tricky in kind of modeling over a 5-year period where we covered the whole Delta. But in a nutshell, we estimate about 600 lions, and that varies between 540 to 670. But bear in mind, we've done this during a period where the number of lions is actually increasing. So the last sort of official number that was given, I think, was in 2001, when the Winterbox did calling stations, which is basically where you play distress calls of different animals and you get lions to come in, and then you use the same principle where you photograph the lions and you determine how many lions are in the region. And their estimate, including the Linyanti, was around 1,000 lions. So lots of people then tend to panic and say, oh, but the lion numbers are going down. But I think we need to bear in mind that in the Delta, this is part of a cycle. So at the moment, lion numbers are going up, especially after the good drought that we had in 2019. Lots of prey dying, lots of weak prey around. So lion cubs had really good survival, and those lion numbers are going up. So I'm actually going to hand over to Brad because he's got some good insights into lion behavior in different parts of the Delta.
Evening, everyone. My name's Brad, and I'm a filmmaker working with the Natural History Film Unit. Just to follow up on what Robyn is saying, I don't know if everybody remembers a while ago, Mike Claase released a paper saying that a lot of the animals were in decline, ungulates around the Delta system. One of the things, benefits of living here and growing up here is you see these natural cycles moving. And you must bear in mind that the buffalo fence was essentially established to separate cattle and wildlife, but it was done during a low cycle in terms of flooding. And we've been, when I grew up and my dad started Kakaba, he went in a two-wheel drive Ford Ranchero and he drove supplies and staff into Kakaba. Soon after I was born, you couldn't access it without a boat, and I grew up a life in water. When I was a teenager in the early 90s, we drove with the Drotskys in a Series 2 Land Rover across the channel to Mahembo, right in front of the BDF Wanela area. To give you an idea of that cycle that keeps repeating. And we have come out during the time with Mike Claase, when he released those papers, we had an extended period of flooding. And the whole system survives on that turn of flooding and drying. And what is happening is a lot of that nutrient, valuable nutrient and change that was happening was actually happening outside of the buffalo fence. So a lot of the animals will be driven out, and a constant waterlogged area is not ideal habitat for prey, which then affects the lions. So, there's a long wave of population dynamics that has to be taken into consideration. And I think that we've had a long period of wet. We're heading into a dry cycle. We're in the transition, which is a little confusing because you're getting a bit of both. And you sometimes get incredible rain and a bit of flood, and it looks like there's a lot of water, but we are transitioning into a dry cycle. And with this dry cycle, we're going to start seeing an increase of animal populations and predator populations that follow.
I'm just going to skip ahead a couple of slides. So this basically illustrates what Brad was alluding to. So this was just an experiment to look at the difference between, what it's like for lions at times of very low flood and what it's like for lions at times of very high flood. So we used some movement data from collars, and we got an idea of how lions will move around the Delta based on the water. So we developed what you call a resistance map, which basically maps how easy or how difficult it is for lions to move across the Delta at different times of the year. So this data was based on data from 2014 to 2016. So 2014 we had relatively high floods, and it slowly went down. So if you look on the far right, you can see the left-hand picture is basically all core connected area for lions. So that means it's not very fragmented. There's a lot of ease of movement. You can see Chiefs Island is a really important core. And all around the west and the south, and then going up north towards Kwai and across to that Mababi Depression. So there's a lot of connectivity, and this was during a very the lowest flood of 2016. So when there's a lot of movement still possible. But then if you look at the same year, in 2016, where we model how lions can possibly move, on the far right is the maximum flood. And you can see there that the western cores, which indicate good movement, almost completely disappear. So this kind of alludes to what Brad was saying about how as soon as the floods come in, a lot of the animals, especially on the western side of the Delta, they get pushed out towards the peripheries, as do the lions, because they obviously then follow the prey, and there's a lot less land available for them. That's just to illustrate what Brad was saying. And then to move on to the leopards. So this is the result of the leopard densities that we got from the camera trap surveys for the Delta. And you can see that western area and Chiefs Island are really important leopard habitat. Again, in the Abu area and the Queenie area, we had about 10 lions per 100 square kilometers. So again, very high densities. And I might hand over to Brad again because he's got a bit of insight. He's doing some filming in that area, so he can give you an indication of what this means and how this changes leopard behavior.
Through sort of years of observation and spending a lot of time with particular leopards, what we're finding is that not only does a lot of the research that we accumulate and look at, not from other areas within Africa, doesn't really apply to the Okavango at all. And in some areas, it doesn't even apply to different parts of the Delta. They don't correlate. They do totally different things. We spent seven years with a particular female leopard in Savuti, and she had 3 generations of cubs during that time. And she had a high success rate, very marginal area. She had the advantage of the hills and areas to protect them. Ideal scenario, but the densities weren't incredibly high. And every time she pushed a cub out, every one of those offspring that she had was male and female. Male sort of lingers around not knowing what he's doing, and the female has to be pushed out when she comes into breeding again. And she'd always give away a part of her territory to her offspring. So the one female that owned Leopard Rock, she gave the north to one of her daughters, and then she gave the Mitshipi Island to another daughter, and then she gave the southern part to another daughter. And she would lose pieces of it. And we know through research throughout that there's a very high tolerance of leopards towards siblings and leopards towards offspring. They will allow their offspring to take part of the territory. They're still quite competitive over that, but it doesn't come to blood, it doesn't come to blows. So there's a lot of overlap, and this explains a lot of the overlap potential that there is, where it's better to have your blood around you and not be competing, life and death over area and resources. We moved into 29, and in that area, incredibly high leopard populations, and over time, we've been filming in and out of that area for about 7 or 8 years, and through IDs and whisker patterns, we've actually started to ID that there's a lot of relatives and a lot of family orientated in that particular area. When you get these really, really high densities, the majority of those cats are actually related, which is quite interesting. We've got 2 females who are sisters. Both of them have had cubs. Their cubs are now having cubs, and they all cross over in the same area. We've got an area where we call 6 Leopard Tree, and it's an area where we've seen 6 separate leopards in the same bush, in the same environment. And ultimately, they're all related. They're sort of cousins of each other. And I think that these high density areas down there's a lot of that going on. And what we found is when those densities are that high, it's very much the passing through of males that changes, not so much the females and their bases. So it's just an interesting observation. And also, that particular area has an incredibly different makeup of prey species. The leopard in Savuti, as an observation, we had her killing about 35, 36 different species of prey. The leopards that we have worked with in the last couple of years, there's probably 7 different species in the Delta and where those high densities are. So it's obviously prey driven, but the diversity of what they eat it determines the sort of populations and how small the territories can be. And the overlaps, I mean, Robynne will probably tell you about the numbers and how many, the sort of overlapping that is happening in these bottom western areas is just quite extraordinary.
So this again illustrates what Brad was saying, and I think that's what's so interesting about studying carnivores in the Okavango, because there's a constant flux in terms of the flood. So, territories may not be territories in the traditional sense that they may be elsewhere. So this is an example on the left-hand side there. That's 5 different prides that were in the area that Brad is currently working in. And the densities at that point were really, really high, and there was such a high degree of overlap in the territories, almost 80%. So obviously they weren't all in the same place at the same time. They were avoiding each other in time, and they do this a lot through vocalizations. But this was a period when we went from really one of the lowest floods on record, which was in 1997, to much higher floods in 2004. So we had really high lion numbers, and then suddenly they got squashed into a really small area. So this is an example of how behaviorally they have to adapt to the flood, and they've had to adapt to kind of a changing environment. And most of these prides, we measured the change in dry land available in their annual home ranges. And it went from 80% dry land in 1997 to around 25% dry land. So they had a really small period of time in which they had to adapt to very little land available. And then in contrast, if you fast forward to the right-hand side, that's 2013 to 2016. So it was starting to get drier. And there's a lot more exclusivity in terms of home ranges. And that's probably because the lion numbers were low. So they were coming out of a really high flood phase where the lion numbers had dropped. So they could kind of establish exclusive territories. And so we'll probably see this swing back to a similar situation again now if we go through a couple of dry years. So this is all examples of how the fluctuations in the delta can alter behavior, alter territories, and where animals move. So, and speaking of territories, I'll hand over to Megan now because she has some good insights into the wild dogs.
Yeah, so the dogs are also influenced by these same factors that are driving the lion and the leopard distributions and movements. So this is just a map of some of the dispersals that we've seen on the wild dogs, and they are to a part influenced by the flood as well. There's certain dispersal corridors to the west that get blocked off when the water is high. But what we have seen that seems to be the primary factor that influences where they disperse and how successful their dispersal is are human settlements. So all of the dogs that have been collared that have moved south have not been successful. So they die, basically. So it seems that human settlement is a big barrier to dispersal in this species. And obviously the water and stuff. But one of the points I wanted to make is that despite the huge diversity and the dynamics that go on in this system, it's still an amazing system to study the natural behavior of these carnivores, where you can't do this in many other places in Africa. And this enables you to go into the fine scale details, which is kind of what I've been doing. So I've been spending the last 4 or 5 years looking at wild dog scent marking, basically, and their use of latrines. So by following the dogs intensively and finding these marking sites, we're starting to unravel their communication system with each other, which is important for a number of reasons. So we think it's primarily to do with territoriality, which would make sense because wild dogs have no long distance vocalization, so it makes sense that they communicate with scent. This is supported by the fact, some boring graphs, that they visit the marking sites throughout the year. They don't stop when they're denning, which suggests that despite the energetic attention of the pack going on raising puppies, they still take time to go visit these marking sites and advertise their presence to other packs. But they do visit significantly less in the denning season, but they still visit. We've also been trying to find and understand where these marking sites are. So another graph, but basically this shows that marking sites are closer to roads. We also find that they're closer to pans, and they avoid grassland areas and areas where there's permanent water, which could be because of lions, because lions love grassland areas. And even though dogs love hunting in grassland areas, they probably don't want to have their communication site, which they repeatedly visit, in a grassland area. So that also makes sense. So why is this all important? Going into so much detail and spending painstaking hours looking at which wild dog marks where. Firstly, ecologically, because it's an important aspect of their behavior and their life history that was not really known very well and definitely understudied. It helps us with monitoring. And this, I think, ties into the next one, which is conservation. So even in our area where we have very, very good monitoring of the wild dog packs, we are still getting so much more information from these marking sites based on which dogs visit. We're seeing dispersing dogs visit. We're learning new insights into pack formations and how dispersing individuals join together for a few days and then they just don't like each other and split up again. And this basically loads of things we're learning about their behavior. But I think one of the most important things which can be applied to elsewhere in Africa where maybe wild dogs aren't doing so well is that if you can find these marking sites and put camera traps up, the dogs come to you and then you can monitor them remotely. So dogs are very, very difficult to monitor accurately over a large area, especially in other places in Africa where the habitat isn't quite as nice as the Delta. So if you can find these marking sites either by observing dogs, which is tricky when you don't know where they are, but if you can look for evidence of these marking sites and put camera traps up, then you can start to understand the packs, which is potentially better than the traditional methods of determining dog densities with just normal camera trap surveys. Maybe Robyn can explain to you why traditional survey methods are so difficult for dogs, because
yeah, this is something we've been discussing in terms of estimating dog numbers, because obviously they move in packs, which are so cohesive. So what we found using stills is that you'll have a pack of 20, but because they're moving so quickly down the road, you'll capture maybe one or two individuals of the pack. Whereas what Megan is doing is really identifying where they are marking at the marking sites and using video. And so this is a much more effective way of getting an estimate of group size and then also identifying the individuals. So what we found with the Delta surveys, with dog and cheetahs, we're not actually getting enough captures of stills to be able to estimate densities. So except in the Santawani area where there is actually really high dog density, so we have managed to get a density estimate, but out of 10 surveys in the Delta, that's the only area that we did actually get enough stills. So we're actually looking at whether we can compare the two and whether using videos and looking at individuals and pack sizes is actually a good way to estimate dog densities going forward, and whether that can then be taken to other environments as a way of estimating numbers. So I was just saying, I think we've kind of presented enough now, and I'm going to open the questions, which I'll pose to Brad and Megan, and this really has to do with the dogs. What have been your observations in terms of dogs and population fluctuations, how that relates to the flood, and basically pack dynamics, how that changes when the flood changes across the Delta?
In 29 and 30, we had in 2018, 2019, we had unbelievable populations of dogs. We had a pack of 27, and they had a number of pups, 12, 15, success rate of about 80% surviving. Pack grew a lot. And then the year after, 2020, 2021, we had huge rainfall, not necessarily flood, but the rainfall filled all the floodplains and really cut off the area. In the dry period, the lion populations were dispersed, dogs thrived, and when that water came, by the time they denned again, lion populations were condensed, and they had 14 pups and only 12 survived. And, we saw a number of them killed by lions, finding the dens and literally, just destroying the pups. And since then, that with that water, that entire population is completely disbanded, and the pack is broken and fragmented now into groups of 7 or 8, and then the biggest, I think, is 14. The 7 or 8 are kind of in decline. You need a certain amount of numbers for a pack to really survive and grow, and they've just been deteriorating from 9, 7, 6, 5. We've got now 4. We thought we were clever when they were a 6-pack, but they just went down. And it's just I think that the water fluctuations have a huge impact in their populations, their population growth, and I think that the Delta in a dry period will probably be very advantageous for dogs and growing. But high flood levels means that you'll get dispersal further into Chobe, further into other areas, and I think that that's the big thing about the Delta is the change. Behavior. We all have an idea of what they do, but depending on where you are and what area and what concession is flooding and drying, will really determine what that population does. And one study about animals in a particular area cannot be extrapolated against the whole system. It's much more fluid than that, and it can change within years, like it has with the dogs in that area. So, it's sort of caution that we need to know more about those fluctuations and those patterns before we just extrapolate across an entire system. And that's really what makes the Delta so unique. And I think you'll get waves of populations expanding and contracting in the cycles of the floods just because of availability of surface area and prey. And I think those cycles need to be taken into account. We've gone through a tough area and I think we're going into a better area, but it doesn't all of a sudden mean, we can utilize them more than we did before. It's in a cycle and it's going to return. It's something to bear in mind, when projecting forward, I think.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that for sure. I think there's a difference, between the dogs and the lions. I think the lions are more directly impacted by the flood, and that's one of the main drivers of their populations. But I think for the dogs, they're influenced to a certain extent by the flood, but I think they're primarily influenced by the lions. So they're having lots of fluctuating factors influencing their populations. And yeah, they're so fragile. They just need one bad year and the whole pack disintegrates. Like we had a pack of 37 and 2 years later there was 4 left because they had 2 bad years. It's the same for the reverse. They have one good year and then they're thriving. One of the things that the lions do, which I think is maybe less obvious, so obviously they kill dogs, which is bad for dogs and especially puppies. But one thing that they also do is they disrupt the packs. So when there's very high lion densities, obviously they're picking off dogs. And this in turn can disrupt pack dynamics, which is also not great for dogs because stable packs are better at raising puppies. So new packs have a third less pups of survivorship we've seen in our data. So new packs aren't great, and lions constantly killing dogs driving new pack formation is also not great. So you can have maybe like very slow decreases of dogs, but then when the lions crash because they eat all the prey and the flood affects them, then maybe they can spring back up again. So it's just very complicated.
And with that, I think we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you. I think what's really interesting is we're getting exactly the same information as we got last time, is that the variation in the flood in the Delta is what drives the system. And although we all love having water in the Borrow and boating and we all want the flood to come, having a high flood every year isn't always a good thing. Has anyone got any questions for this amazing panel? Any? So the question relates to the figures that Robynne gave of a low of 540 and a high of 670 lions. And the question is, where do they go or where do they come from?
Thanks, Eddie. Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. Just to clarify, the 540 to the 670, that's basically the range that we think the true number lies within. But if we look at long term, lion population does not climb or decrease in a linear manner. So if you look at something like leopards, if you have a slow decline because of prey numbers or loss of habitat, you'll basically get kind of a straight line that goes from A to B, like in a slow decline. And the way that lion populations change, because they live in social groups, is you get, this is very technical, but it's called a saltatory equilibrium. So that basically means that the population can jump very quickly, but it can also decline very quickly. And I think, so as Megan pointed out, it's the same with the dogs, and that has to do with basically their social structure. So when lions are doing badly, so basically when you're transitioning now from very low flood to very high flood, you can see on the top left corner there, that's basically the reproductive rate, which drops off quite drastically. And that is due to competition from neighbors. So because there's a lot more females around, there's a lot more stress, you get a lot less reproduction. And then that bottom graph, I know the writing's not that clear, but that shows basically the age structure of the population. So if you look at the far left, that's 1997. The dark part is the adults, and then you've got the sub-adults in gray and the cubs in white. So you can see the proportion of cubs and sub-adults drops off quite quickly when the reproductive rate is low. So then what you have in 2004 is basically you have a lion population that's composed mostly of adults. And then they have a couple of successive years of poor reproduction. And that's when you start to lose entire prides. So Brad might be able to comment on this, but what we observed in Mambo, for example, Mambo went through a transition where you would talk to guys like Matt Copham and they say, oh, we went on game drive and we saw 70 different lions, which is a lot, whether that's the true number or the perceived number. But when you have a situation where you have a lot of adults and they're not recruiting into the population, you can basically have an entire pride disappear within a 3 or 4 year period, which may be 5 or 6 individuals. So with the Moporota pride in Mambo, when we started work there in 2014, they were having cubs, but those cubs were not surviving. And the core of the pride was 4 adult females. And then they started dying of old age. And like us, lions go into menopause. So once they get really, really old, they actually stop reproducing. So then suddenly you have a number of prides that will disappear, and that's 4, 5, 6 individuals at a time that will disappear over 2 or 3 year period. So that's why you get these kind of jumps in the lion population because of how the social structure works and the interaction with the reproductive rate. I hope that answers your question.
Through observation, some of the stuff that we've picked up with lions is by far the greatest mortality that we've seen in lion populations, and all the lions we've filmed, has been siblicide, surprisingly. We've filmed 4 different occasions where siblings at different ages. So it's about timing of when the cubs are born. They try and sync them that they're very similar ages. As soon as you've got cubs of ages that are 5 to 6 months apart, very often you get siblicide happening, and we've seen that more than infanticide. So I think that's a major player in the social dynamic. I mean, they're fairly new in their evolutionary process, and they're still trying to sort out the whole priding thing as a big cat. And I think that, this is one of the throwbacks from that evolution, where you've got, populations and driven in the same. It happens with very stable populations, and it happens in transitions with lion prides. So stable prides with females not syncing their cubbing. It's happened in Savuti 3 times in Savuti. We've seen it in other parts in the Delta where it's a takeover from one pride to another. New cubs come in. During that transition, you get, because of the testosterone and the fighting that happens with the lions, the first litter that comes after the transition is generally dominated by about 85% male in terms of their offspring. And in that, you start getting a lot of siblicide happening because males are quite, they're boisterous and exactly. And I mean, it's interesting just in terms of that whole thing. I mean, we've seen a change from the consumptive period to the non-consumptive period, and there was all of a sudden a complaint from everybody. There's so many male lions running around everywhere, and that's the system correcting itself. Getting to a point where you've got natural progression and movement between males that dominate prides, and you get a much bigger dispersal. And in that changeover, you get more males. Every time you get this takeover from one pride, one dominant male to the next. And then you get a lot of males and high density of males, and then that dispersal is far greater. And that's something else that we've noticed, over the years.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. That's exactly what we observed in the Western Delta when we first started. The lion numbers were quite low. There was a very high flood, and the male tenure was actually quite long. So we were following a pride for 4 years. The males were 10, 11 years old, and they stayed the pride males that whole time. We only observed one sort of changeover. And then as soon as the flood levels dropped, that's when we started doing the camera trap surveys. And suddenly there was an influx of sub-adult and adult males. And that was the first time since I'd started there in 2012 that we'd actually started to see male turnover, because it was that combination of being isolated and then good survivorship in some of the prides. And then suddenly you have an influx of dispersers and of males. And then the changeover that follows.
Anyone else? Question? Oh, got one here? Yeah. Okay, so the question relates to areas with very high densities of leopards, where Brad said that they're likely all closely related. And the question is, how does that affect the genetics for the leopards?
So most of from what I understand, I mean, these clever people to my left might have another answer. But from what I understand, like with breeding racehorses or breeding dairy farming cattle, there's a certain amount of incest that's intolerated. It's sort of one generation. Moving on to the second starts becoming dodgy. And what you find is that it's normally based on the short lifespan they have and how long it takes those individuals to become sexually mature. And that tenure normally is quicker than it takes for the natural process of a male to be replaced. And there isn't really an issue with that if the males are consistently being replaced in the area. So you won't necessarily get incest if the male tenure keeps changing. And that's why that sibling, and it's really females more than it is males. Their tolerance with family members, their tolerance with offspring is very much female driven. Males, they just wander around and they, follow their dicks to the next territory. And they disperse as they go. But the females become sedentary and they take up ownership. And as long as the males are changing, you don't have that problem.
So the question relates to what's been discussed about large population crashes and population increases and how that affects genetics and whether there are bottlenecks in the genetics.
I can answer this question from a lion perspective because that's really kind of where I have the most information. So if we're talking specifically about the Delta, what's considered a viable population, which means a population that's big enough that you're not really going to experience inbreeding. We're looking at about 500 individuals or about 50 prides is kind of the baseline, which is what we have in the Delta. And I don't think I could be wrong, as Mike pointed out, depending on how things change. It's unlikely that we're dipping too much below that in terms of lion numbers. What is really interesting about genetics in the Delta is that there was a student here a couple of years ago that used to work for Wilderness. His name was Simon Dures. And he sampled different lion populations from around the Delta, and he looked at their genetics within the Delta itself, and then also in comparison to the surrounding Kalahari lions, so some from the CKGR, some from the north towards Linyanti. But basically what he found, and this is kind of reinforced by the flooding patterns, is that lions in the central Delta, so we're talking about Chiefs Island and the immediate kind of surrounding small islands, they seem to have a unique, what he called was the Delta kind of gene. And they had a larger proportion of this gene and a very small proportion of what was considered alike to the Kalahari lions. So you have Chiefs Island and the immediate surrounding islands. And then on the western side of the Delta, also there was a higher proportion of what was considered to be a Delta gene and still a small proportion of the Kalahari gene. And then as you moved around the Delta towards the east, you got bigger and bigger proportions of the Kalahari gene. So basically that is an interaction with the flooding. So you can see, if you look on the far right, where those kind of core areas are during periods of high flood, there's a lot of movement within Chiefs Island itself, but not really going outwards. And then also you've lost that kind of core in the west. So that explains why they have what would be considered more of the Delta gene. Whereas if you go around to the eastern side of the Delta, I'm not sure how obvious it is, but there are corridors connecting the east going towards Mababi and Savuti. So there you've got a bigger admixture then of lions from other areas.
I mean, I think the bottom line with the genetics is Botswana, by the low population of people in general, and the link between the parks that we have and the natural flow, even with predators moving through areas that are inhabited by people. Botswana, because of the way it breathes and the nature of the environment, probably has some of the most solid genetic integrity through most of the animals that exist. And it's that freedom of movement that gives it that and has that integrity. And I think that's something, even with local communities, the game still moves through, but opening those corridors will maintain it. And that's what ultimately makes Botswana one of the most important areas for lion populations, is because they have that movement. And I think that's a very key thing to bear in mind in making these corridors. And Botswana, by default, starts becoming integral to a lot of populations' genetic integrity.
The question is, what is the estimated total number of lions in Botswana?
Okay, so the last kind of, I guess, formalized country estimate was about 3,500 across the whole of Botswana. And that was based on work going up until 2015. But the short answer is we don't know. I think camera traps has been a really good advancement in terms of estimating carnivores. I don't know, if you go into a camp, the lions are really tame and you can see them. They're very relaxed. But in some of the more marginal areas, they're really, really shy. So it's very hard to count lions directly. So I think with camera trap technology, we're moving towards getting better numbers. But at this stage, the short answer is that is a complete estimate, and that's based on what we've seen in small areas that have been extrapolated to larger areas. And so that's something in carnivore conservation that we're currently trying to improve.
I think the key thing to remember, particularly with lions, is if you need to look at beyond the actual number, because it's about social structure. So if you think about what is the population of cheetah left in Africa?
7,000.
No, 7,500.
7,500. But it takes a male and a female, and they have offspring. Whereas lion populations, the pride dynamic is totally different. So if you deal with a breeding population, then lion populations are a lot smaller than what cheetah are. So in essence, lions are approaching the vulnerability of cheetah, which is an appendix A and threatened species. So the reality is you've got to take that broader thing into consideration when you work out total numbers.
Question.
A bit more about it.
Okay, so the question is about movement corridors. I think maybe just a bit more explanation about how you worked out where they were, where they go through, their protection status. Do they cross borders, and how does that work?
So the corridors at this stage, I think, do not have international protection in terms of individual corridors. So if you look at the map here, kind of that core area in Botswana, which surrounds Chobe, reaches across to Wangi and the Delta. Those areas all between are designated as wildlife use areas, whether it's consumptive or non-consumptive, which kind of facilitates that high level of connectivity. So if you're moving out from that core going outwards, a lot of those corridors are basically ones that we've predicted exist, but our current work on dispersal with lions and Botswana Predators Conservation's current dispersal work on wild dogs is basically trying to verify that those corridors exist coming out of those different cores. So basically what we've done to kind of create this predictive map is used movement data from lions in different areas, looked at what they avoid and which areas they select, and then extrapolated that onto the CASA system, which is the Trans-Frontier Conservation Area between Botswana, Angola, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and Namibia. And so part of our conservation efforts going forward for some of these corridors, some of the really key ones that exist, for example, between the Central Kalahari Game Reserve going up to the Okavango, and as you can see from the Okavango Delta going west towards Namibia, those are kind of really key corridors, and we're hoping to do conservation work in those areas that can facilitate that movement. And I think it's really confusing sometimes with corridors, because I think sometimes people get the impression that, oh, you're going to put a corridor up here, that means, you're going to kind of fence a straight line and nothing else will be able, there will be no other land uses in that area. And that's not necessarily the case. Basically, what it means is making an area wildlife friendly enough that if you have a disperser moving through, that he's not going to get shot because there's really high levels of human-lion conflict, for example. So there's many ways to go about securing corridors. They may not necessarily have to be gazetted. You could even come to, conservation easement agreements with certain communities, help resolving human-wildlife conflict, particularly for the carnivores, and then for other species like elephants, also helps facilitate that movement. So it's not that, there's populations of lions that are suddenly going to spring up in those areas. It's just making it friendly enough that if they are moving, they can cross from A to B, basically without mortalities.
I think the essence of it is that as these populations diminish, which is the reality, it's important that we're vigilant about the connectivity if we want to keep it. As soon as you isolate a population, you will run into genetic issues. And as long as there's a filtration coming, Mike, you might remember about 6 or 7 years ago, we ended up with a collared lion in the Delta that was collared in Namibia. And it came right through the Shikawi, that whole top section, and took up residence in the Delta system. So there is massive movement. And I couldn't help but notice with your dispersal of the wild dogs, I don't know where that slide is, but this dispersal of wild dogs in this system is very much a mirror of the entire watershed and the Delta system itself, the catchment and the Delta. If you got a book that you were part of, it's very much a similar thing. If you looked at the entire water catchment of the entire Delta system, and they published a thing recently where a bunch of guys in Zambia lost a few dogs that were collared, and they were reported 3 months later in Mozambique. So they went all the way down the Zambezi Valley through Zimbabwe, and were found in Mozambique. So there's a definite habitat dispersal if you follow that lateral line and you follow the Zambezi catchment as well. What would be interesting is what is the drift between here and the Zambezi from a genetic point of view. There's got to be a connection.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay, we're going to wrap up. What I'd like to just have as a final word from you guys is if you could each give us an idea of what you think is the most important conservation aspect or a burning question that you think needs to be answered, what we can do to find out more and conserve these carnivores.
I think I'd like to actually touch on citizen science and the role that it can play in research today. We've touched a little bit on the importance of AI and how that's basically improving our ability to process data. And what Megs was talking about earlier with African Carnivore Wild Book, we can process a lot more information. For example, people visiting game reserves, sending pictures of wild dogs, sending pictures of male lions, that we can ID using the whisker spots. One of the key things that we've seen also just collaborating across different NGOs is you can pick up really long distance dispersal just by sharing information. So, we did a camera trap survey in Santawani with BPC in 2020. And in 2021, we did another survey in Nyanti. And 6 of the lions from Maremi that were born in the Black Pools area actually were captured on both surveys. So we captured them first in Maremi and then on the next survey up in the Nyanti. So we had a coalition of 6 males that dispersed that long distance. And that was through processing a lot of imagery, sharing information between organizations. So I really want to stress the role of citizens basically getting involved in these long distance dispersals. And where projects exist like BPC and with us, looking at wild dogs and lions, sharing pictures even from your safari can help us basically identify key dispersal routes, figure out where the animals are moving. So I think from a conservation point of view going forward, I think that's really one of the key things for me.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. For me, it would be understanding how the wild dogs are communicating, which is a big key factor in the bioboundary project, which we have going. The bioboundary project is basically trying to understand how wild dogs communicate with each other. We want to hijack that system and replicate it and put it in a bottle and pretend to be packs living in livestock areas to stop dogs setting up residence in those livestock areas, because that's where they come into often fatal conflict with people. So that is obviously a very good thing, and I think it can have major applications not only in Botswana, but also in places where there are no dogs. And if you introduce dogs into empty parks, they need neighbors to settle. So you can keep them in these new parks by pretending to be packs surrounding them. I also think if we can replicate these marking sites, especially by creating scent and not having to go and collect wild dog scent all the time, which is very labor intensive and expensive and hard, you can create marking sites in places that are easy to monitor, and then this can help assess wild dog populations in understudied areas. So there's huge areas in Central Africa and West Africa where it's just not known what's going on with wild dogs, and they could be some of the most important places for wild dog conservation going into the future. So I think understanding what's going on there is very important, and I think you can use bioboundary and the chemicals to do that. So yeah, that's me.
Just a thought on what they're talking about. I mean, what a better way for a guide to engage a guest. Contribute to conservation. Take pictures of the animals, send them to us, share them, let us put them into a database, feedback to your guest. There's information that comes readily and very, it's good for projects like this. Looking at the cycles that are going on, if we're going in the trends that I've been through and global warming doesn't have too much of an impact in changing those trends, I think I'd just like people to be aware that when we enter into a really dry cycle in this system again, these are periods where Ikoho Lagoon dries up entirely. The panhandle dries up other than the river and the water. There's nothing protected in the panhandle. That just becomes exposed to livestock. The water fluctuation protects it. There's nothing protected there. And if we enter into those dry cycles again, we're going to experience an unbelievable amount of pressure from fires, from destruction on the delta system itself. We may even end up in stages where parts of the panhandle start drying up. Remember, early 1990s, you didn't have the offtake of water that you're getting from Angola. You didn't have all of those pressures added to this. And, I'm worried that in an incredibly dry cycle, if we get there in the next decade, may have an incredible impact on the viability of this entire system. So, in terms of your projection forward, that would be, something that I would definitely take into consideration.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for sitting so attentively, and I hope enjoying your lovely beers. The speakers will be milling around for a little bit, so you can come and assault them with your questions. But otherwise, thank you very much for a very enjoyable evening, and thank you, panelists, for a lot of information and support and agreement, which was great. All right, thank you.